In the quiet curve of Nova Scotia's coastline, where the sea fog clung to the cliffs like old secrets, Ilara Voss stood on her back porch watching the tide roll in. She was 56, with silver threading through her dark curls and hands that bore the faint scars of decades spent handling delicate sea creatures. For years, she'd been known in the small town of Black Harbor as the woman who could tell you everything about humpback migration patterns, but almost nothing about herself. She lived alone in a weathered cedar house passed down from her parents, its windows always open to the salt air, its shelves lined with books on marine biology and faded photographs in mismatched frames. Lately, though, the house felt different. Lighter somehow. Boxes of pale blue fabric sat folded in the living room. A dressmaker had come twice that week. And on the kitchen table, beside a half-finished cup of chamomile tea, lay an invitation printed on thick cotton paper. Ilara Voss and Rurik Hale request the pleasure of your company. Rurik Hale. The name still felt foreign on her tongue, even after 2 years. He was Icelandic, tall, quiet, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a voice so soft you had to lean in to hear him. They'd met during her sabbatical in Reykjavik, where she'd been studying the impact of warming currents on Arctic cod. He'd been restoring an old lighthouse on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, spending his days sanding wood and watching the northern lights. There was no grand romance, no whirlwind courtship. Just two people who'd found each other in the quiet spaces between loss and longing. He'd lost his wife to illness 10 years prior. She'd lost her husband, Cale, to something far less clear. They didn't talk much about the past. That was part of the comfort. Now they were getting married. Not for spectacle, but for companionship. At their age, Ilara told herself, love wasn't about fireworks, it was about someone who remembered how you took your tea and didn't mind the silence. What she didn't expect was that her daughter would come. Tamsin hadn't set foot in Black Harbor in 6 years. Not since the funeral. Not since the day she'd packed a single duffel bag, kissed her mother's cheek with lips that felt like stone, and walked out without looking back. She'd been 22 then, raw and furious, convinced her mother had hidden something about her father's death. Ilara had tried to explain Cale's heart, the suddenness, the doctor's note. But Tamsin refused to believe a man who swam 3 miles every morning could just collapse in his sleep. She'd left to chase truth with a camera in her hands and grief in her ribs, photographing refugee camps, climate protests, forgotten villages, anywhere but home. And yet here was Tamsin's name on the guest list. Not because Ilara had asked, but because she'd sent the invitation anyway. Just one, slipped into a plain envelope with no return address, mailed to a P.O. box in Lisbon that she'd found through an old friend who followed Tamsin's photo essays online. Inside, no formal wording, just a single line in Ilara's looping script. I'd like you to be here. She hadn't expected a reply. But 3 weeks later, Tamsin booked a flight from Morocco, where she'd been documenting drought-affected farming communities. She didn't call, didn't text. Just showed up at the Halifax airport, lugging a battered suitcase and a camera bag slung over one shoulder. Her hair cropped short, her skin sun-browned and freckled. Ilara met her at the curb, heart hammering like it belonged to a much younger woman. They stood there for a long moment, mother and daughter separated by years in silence before Tamsin finally stepped forward and hugged her, stiffly, briefly. You look older, she said not unkindly. And you look like your father, Ilara replied, voice catching. They drove back to Black Harbor in near silence, the only sound the hum of tires on wet pavement and the occasional cry of a gull. Tamsin stared out the window, watching the pines blur past, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask about the wedding, didn't ask about Rurik, but Ilara could feel the questions building behind her daughter's eyes like pressure before a storm. That night, over a simple dinner of baked haddock and roasted potatoes, Rurik arrived. He wore a navy sweater and carried a small bouquet of wild roses he'd picked along the coastal trail. He greeted Tamsin with a nod and a quiet, "It's good to meet you," his accent thick but warm. Tamsin studied him, his posture, his hands, the way he glanced at her mother when he thought no one was looking. There was kindness in him, she had to admit, but something else too, attention, like a rope pulled too tight. Over the next few days, Tamsin wandered the town like a ghost, revisiting old haunts. She walked the beach where she and her father used to collect sea glass. She sat on the dock where he taught her to tie sailor's knots. She even stopped by the old marine lab, now half abandoned, where Cale had worked as a technician before his death. The building smelled of damp wood and rust, but one of the lockers still bore his name in peeling paint. Back at the house, she noticed things. The way Rurik avoided the topic of his past work, how he never spoke about Iceland beyond the landscapes, how during a casual conversation about architecture, he flinched slightly when someone mentioned Reykjavik. And then there were the looks. Quick, silent exchanges between him and Alara that vanished the moment Tamsin entered the room. The rehearsal dinner was held at a small inn overlooking the harbor. Candles flickered on linen-draped tables. Local musicians played soft fiddle tunes in the corner. Tamsin sat between her mother's oldest friend Maren and a quiet woman named Inga who introduced herself as Rurik's cousin. Wine flowed, laughter rose and fell, and for a moment Tamsin almost felt like she belonged. But then during a lull in the music she overheard Inga whisper to Maren, "It's strange, isn't it? That he'd come back after all this time." Maren lowered her voice. "Do you think she knows?" "Alara, I doubt it. She never asked the hard questions. Not after Cale." Tamsin's fork clinked against her plate. She pretended to adjust her camera strap, angling her body slightly to catch more. "And Rurik was there," Inga continued almost too softly to hear. "In Reykjavik. Same year Cale disappeared for those months. Same lab." Tamsin froze. Her father had never mentioned working in Iceland. He'd been a local man, born and raised in Nova Scotia. His only trips abroad were brief conferences in Boston or Montreal. Disappeared for months? Her mind raced. Later that night, unable to sleep, she crept into the attic, a place she hadn't visited since childhood. Dust motes danced in the beam of her phone light as she sifted through trunks of old clothes, holiday decorations, and yellowed newspapers. Then, in a wooden box tucked beneath a stack of quilts, she found it, a photo album labeled Summer '89 in her father's handwriting. Most of the pictures were of Black Harbor, the lighthouse, the fishing boats, her as a baby wrapped in a striped blanket. But near the back, one photo stood out. It showed a younger Cale, lean and grinning, standing beside another man on a rocky shore. The other man had Rurik's sharp jawline, the same slope of the shoulders, the same quiet intensity in his eyes. Though his hair was darker, his face unlined. They were holding up a strange-looking device, laughing like old friends. On the back in faded ink, Reykjavik, with R, Project Theta. Tamsin's breath caught. R, Project Theta. She'd never heard those words before. She sat on the dusty floor for a long time, the photo trembling in her hand. Why had her mother never mentioned this? Why had Rurik never said he knew her father? And what was Project Theta? Downstairs, the house was silent. But Tamsin could feel the weight of secrets pressing against the walls, thick as the coastal fog outside. She thought of her father, his laugh, his habit of humming old sea shanties while fixing the boat, the way he'd tuck wildflowers behind her ear before school. He hadn't been the kind of man to vanish without a word. And he certainly hadn't been the kind to take his own life, as the official report had gently suggested years later when questions wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. And now, with the wedding just 2 days away, Tamsin knew she couldn't pretend otherwise. The next morning, she found her mother in the garden, pruning lavender. The air smelled sweet and sharp. "Mom," Tamsin said, holding out the photo. "Who is this?" Alara's shears stilled. Her face went pale. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then carefully, she set the shears down and took the photo. Her fingers traced the edge like it might burn her. "That was a long time ago," she said finally, her voice low. "Before you were born, before everything." "But that's Rurik," Tamsin pressed. "Isn't it?" Alara looked away toward the sea. "He looks like him. But it's not the same man. People change. Memories blur. That's not an answer." "I know," Alara whispered. "But some things are better left buried, Tamsin. For everyone's sake. Even if they're lies." Alara turned then, eyes glistening. "I've never lied to you. You didn't tell me the truth either." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind in the pines. Tamsin wanted to believe her mother, wanted to let it go, to walk down the aisle with her 2 days from now and smile for the photos. But the photo in her hand felt like a key, and she couldn't unsee the lock it fit. Later that afternoon, while Rurik took a walk along the cliffs, Tamsin slipped out of the house and headed into town. She stopped first at the post office where old Mr. Callahan still ran the counter. He'd known her father since they were boys. Cale Voss, Mr. Callahan said, adjusting his glasses. Fine man. Sharp mind. Disappeared for a bit back in '89, didn't he? Came back quieter, like something had been taken out of him. Do you know why he went to Iceland? Tamsin asked. Mr. Callahan frowned. Said it was work. Some government project. Ocean stuff. Came back with a foreign friend. Tall fellow, spoke funny. Stayed with them for a week or two, then vanished. Never saw him again. Till now, I suppose. Rurik. Aye, that's the name. Tamsin's pulse quickened. Did my dad ever say what the project was about? No, but he was jumpy after. Jumpier than usual. Started locking the doors at night. Wrote in that journal of his like his life depended on it. Mr. Callahan leaned closer. You be careful, child. Some stones are meant to stay unturned. But Tamsin had never been good at leaving stones alone. That evening, as rain began to patter against the windows, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, searching for anything on Project Theta and Reykjavik 1989. Most results were dead ends, academic papers, weather reports. But then, buried in a digitized archive of Icelandic news, she found a brief article from October 1989. Fire destroys oceanographic research lab in Reykjavik. 2 scientists presumed dead, no names listed. Just a grainy photo of smoke rising over the harbor. Her hands shook as she clicked through declassified Canadian government documents. One redacted file mentioned collaborative North Atlantic sonar trials involving civilian researchers. Another listed Cale Voss as a technical consultant for a short period in '89. It was enough. She closed the laptop, heart pounding. Her father hadn't just visited Iceland. He'd been part of something secret, something dangerous, and Rurik had been there with him. The wedding was in 2 days, and Tamsin knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if she didn't speak up, the truth might disappear again, this time forever. Outside, the storm rolled in from the sea, waves crashing against the rocks like warnings. Inside, the house held its breath. The morning after finding the photo, Tamsin woke before sunrise with her mind racing like a tide pulled by the moon. Rain still tapped softly against the window, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a damp hush over Black Harbor. She made coffee in the old percolator her father used to swear by. Nothing tastes right unless it's brewed slow, he'd always say, and sat at the kitchen table. The photo from 1989 spread out beside her laptop. She stared at the 2 men on that rocky shore, their arms slung over each other's shoulders like brothers, unaware of the weight the future would place on their friendship. She needed more than whispers and faded newspaper clippings. She needed someone who'd been there. After breakfast, she drove into town and parked outside the Marine Research Center on the edge of the harbor. It was smaller now than it had been in her father's time. Funding cuts had shrunk the staff to just a handful of scientists and interns, but it still carried the same smell of salt, seaweed, and old paper. She asked for Dr. Lenore Varga, a name she'd found in one of her father's old notebooks. According to a footnote scribbled in the margin, Lenore had worked with him on acoustic mapping before he left for Iceland. Dr. Varga was in her late 70s, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and eyes that seemed to hold decades of ocean storms. She peered at Tamsin over half-moon glasses, then nodded slowly when she heard the name Cale Voss. I remember him, she said, motioning for Tamsin to sit in a creaky wooden chair beside her desk. Brilliant mind. Terrible at paperwork, always humming that old shanty about the ghost ship. She smiled faintly. He vanished for a while, didn't he? Came back? Different. Did he ever talk about what he was doing in Reykjavik? Tamsin asked. Lenore hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. Then she leaned forward, voice dropping. It wasn't just Reykjavik. It was a joint project, Canadian, Icelandic, and others, funded by a shadow branch of the Department of National Defense. They called it Project Theta. Officially, it was about tracking deep-sea currents using low-frequency sound waves. Unofficially, she paused, choosing her words carefully. They were testing whether those same waves could disrupt submarine communications. During the Cold War, that kind of thing mattered more than you'd think. Tamsin's stomach tightened. So it was military? Civilian cover, military purpose, Lenore said. Cale didn't know at first. He thought it was pure science. But once he found out, he wanted out. Said it felt wrong, like using the ocean as a weapon. She sighed. He tried to resign. They wouldn't let him. Said he'd signed non-disclosure agreements, that he'd seen too much. What happened then? He went anyway. Flew to Reykjavik under the guise of continuing the work. But I think he was trying to gather proof. To expose it. Lenore's voice grew quieter. Then the lab burned. 2 researchers died. Cale came back a month later, pale and thin. He never spoke about it again. Just buried himself in local work. Tide charts, fish counts, anything that kept him close to home. Did he mention Rurik Hale? Lenore's eyes flickered. Rurik? That's the name he used later, yes. Back then, he went by Ragnar. Ragnar Jonsson. He was the lead acoustic engineer on the Icelandic side. Quiet, intense, brilliant with numbers. Kyle trusted him, more than anyone else on the project. Do you think he had something to do with the fire? I don't know, Lenore said honestly. But after it happened, Ragnar disappeared too. No one heard from him for years, and Cale, well, he started writing in that journal of his like his life depended on it, said he was being watched. Tamsin left the research center with more questions than answers, but also a name, Ragnar Jonsson. That night, she dug deeper online, cross-referencing Icelandic public records and old university directories. She found a thesis from 1987 authored by R. Johnson on resonant frequencies in subsurface water layers. The photo attached was grainy, but unmistakable. It was Rurik, younger, sharper, with a look in his eyes that wasn't quite friendly. She also found a police report from Reykjavik, partially declassified in 2015. It listed the fire as likely accidental, caused by an electrical fault in the sonar calibration room. But one line stood out. Witnesses reported hearing raised voices between Jonsson and Voss hours before the incident. Her father and Rurik had argued. Right before the fire, the next day Tamsin decided to confront Rurik directly. She found him on the coastal path, sitting on a driftwood log, sketching the lighthouse in a small notebook. He looked up as she approached, his expression calm but guarded. Can we talk? She asked. He closed the notebook. Of course. They walked in silence for a while, boots crunching on wet gravel. Finally, Tamsin stopped and turned to him. You knew my father. In Iceland. In 1989. Rurik didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. I did. Why didn't you say anything? Because it's not my story to tell, he said. And because some wounds don't heal, they just scab over. I didn't want to tear yours open. My father died less than a year after he came back, Tamsin said, her voice tight. They said it was a heart attack. But he was healthy, strong. And then suddenly he was gone. Found in the harbor, no note, no explanation. Rurik looked out at the sea, his jaw working. I didn't kill him, Tamsin. I didn't say you did. But you're thinking it. She didn't answer. The wind picked up, carrying the cry of gulls overhead. After a long pause, Rurik spoke again, softer now. Your father was trying to do the right thing. He found out the project was being used to develop a weapon, a way to blind enemy subs by flooding the ocean with disorienting sound. He wanted to leak the data. I tried to stop him, not because I agreed with the military, but because I knew what they'd do to him if he tried. So you argued? Yes, that night, in the lab. I told him to wait, to be smart about it. He said waiting meant more people would suffer. Then the fire started. Fast, too fast. I barely got out. He went back in for the files. I never saw him again that night. Tamsin's breath caught. You think he died in the fire? No, Rurik said quietly. He didn't, he made it out. But he was changed. When I tracked him down months later, he was living in a fishing village in the north of Iceland under a false name. He told me he'd sent the files to a journalist in Oslo. Then he vanished again. I assumed he'd gone home to you. But he came back to Black Harbor, Tamsin whispered. And a few months later, he was dead. Rurik turned to her, his eyes full of something like sorrow. I didn't know he was gone until years later. By then, I'd left everything behind. My name, my work, my country. I joined a monastery in the Highlands. Spent 10 years in silence trying to outrun what I'd been part of. And now you're back, Tamsin said. Why? He looked at her for a long time before answering. Because I saw your photographs. The ones from the Syrian border. The drought camps in Kenya. You have your father's eyes. And his courage. I thought, maybe I could make things right. Not with your mother, but with you. Tamsin didn't know what to believe. Part of her wanted to trust him. His grief felt real, his regret heavy. But another part remembered the way her father's body had been found, floating near the old pier, clothes dry except for his shoes, as if he'd walked into the water fully dressed. The coroner had called it undetermined, but the town had whispered suicide for years. That evening she returned to the attic. This time she searched more carefully. Behind a loose floorboard near the window, she found a small metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was her father's journal, the one Lenore had mentioned. The pages were filled with his tight, slanted handwriting. Most entries were technical: sonar frequencies, water temperatures, equipment logs. But near the end, the tone shifted. October 12, 1989, Reykjavik, Ragnar doesn't understand. This isn't just data, it's the ocean's voice. If they weaponize it, they'll silence everything. Whales, fish, even the currents will scream. I have to get the files out. Oslo contact confirmed. If anything happens to me, tell Elara I'm sorry. Tell Tamsin I loved her before she even knew what love was. November 3, 1989. Black Harbor. They're watching the house. Car with no plates parked down the road. Changed my routine. Told Elara it's stress. She doesn't need to know. If they come for me, I'll go to the lighthouse. Safe place. Knew it since I was a boy. December 1st, 1989. Last entry. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. But the files are safe, sent. Oslo paper will run it in January. Tell Tamsin, be brave. The truth is worth the cost. Tamsin sat on the attic floor, tears blurring the ink. Her father hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been silenced. And someone had made sure the official story stayed clean. She went downstairs and found her mother in the living room, folding napkins for the wedding reception. Elara looked up, saw the journal in Tamsin's hands, and froze. You knew, Tamsin said, her voice breaking. All this time you knew he was in danger. Elara's hands trembled. I suspected, she whispered. But he made me promise not to ask. Said it would keep me safe. After he died, I was so scared. I thought if I pretended it was natural, they'd leave us alone. Who's they? I don't know names. Just men in dark cars. One came to the door a week after the funeral. Said Cale had unfinished business. Told me to stop asking questions. So I did. Elara's eyes filled with tears. I chose silence over truth. And I've lived with that every day since. Tamsin wanted to be angry, but all she felt was a deep, aching sadness. For her father, for her mother, for the years lost to fear. Outside, the sky darkened again. Another storm was coming. And with it, the wedding. Tamsin looked at her mother. Really looked at her. The lines around her eyes. The way her shoulders slumped like they'd been carrying this secret for too long. She thought of Rurik on the cliff, sketching the lighthouse like it held answers. She thought of her father's last words. The truth is worth the cost. She didn't know what she would do yet. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't let them bury it again. Not this time. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and restless, the kind of day that feels like it's holding its breath. Rain had fallen all night, soft and steady, soaking the wildflowers tied to the chapel chairs and turning the gravel path to mud. Inside the old lighthouse chapel, its white paint peeling, its bell long silent, guests began to gather, murmuring in low voices, adjusting their coats, glancing out the salt-fogged windows at the churning sea beyond. Tamsin stood near the back, dressed in a simple gray dress she'd bought in Lisbon, her camera bag slung over one shoulder like armor. She hadn't slept. The journal's words kept circling in her mind. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. Her father hadn't just died. He'd been erased, and now his killer, or at least someone who knew the truth, was about to marry her mother. She watched as Elara walked down the aisle, not in a traditional gown but in a deep blue dress the color of twilight, her silver hair braided with sea lavender. She looked calm, but Tamsin saw the tightness in her hands, the way her eyes darted toward the door every few seconds. She was waiting for something, or someone. Rurik stood at the front beside the minister, wearing a dark wool suit that looked like it had been made for another life. He didn't fidget, didn't smile, just stood there, hands clasped, gaze fixed on the floor as if praying or bracing. The ceremony began quietly. The minister spoke of tides and time, of second chances and quiet love. The wind howled outside, rattling the old window panes. Someone coughed. A gull cried overhead. And then it was time for vows. Alara's voice was steady as she spoke. I promise to walk beside you, not ahead or behind. To listen when you're quiet. To remember your past without letting it drown our future. Rurik took a breath. I promise to honor your silence as much as your words. To protect what you love. And to carry my regrets not as chains but as lessons. It was beautiful, honest even, and that's what made it unbearable. Because Tamsin knew, really knew, that those words were built on a lie. A lie that had cost her father his life. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She thought of walking out, of staying silent, of letting them have this moment however fragile. But then she remembered her father's journal, the way he'd written her name like a prayer. Tell Tamsin. Be brave. She stepped forward. The room fell still. All eyes turned to her. Alara's face went pale. Rurik stiffened. Wait, Tamsin said, her voice clear despite the tremor underneath. The minister paused, confused. Is everything all right? Tamsin walked slowly down the aisle, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. She stopped a few feet from the couple, facing Rurik. Were you in Reykjavik in 1989? She asked loud enough for everyone to hear. A murmur rippled through the guests. Alara reached out as if to stop her, but Tamsin didn't look away from Rurik. He met her gaze. Didn't flinch. Yes. Did you know my father? Yes. Do you know how he really died? Silence thick and heavy. Outside, thunder rolled. Rurik exhaled slowly. I do. That was all it took. The dam broke, Alara gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Tamsin, please. No, Tamsin said, turning to her mother now. You told me he died in his sleep. That it was his heart. But he didn't, did he? He was found in the harbor, fully dressed. No water in his lungs. The coroner couldn't even say for sure it was suicide. And you knew. You've always known. I was trying to protect you, Alara cried, tears streaming down her face. They threatened us. After the funeral, a man came. He said if I asked questions, they'd come for you next. I was scared, Tamsin. I was just a young widow with a daughter who looked too much like her father. Tamsin's voice softened, but she didn't back down. I'm not a child anymore, and I deserve the truth. She turned back to Rurik. You were there the night the lab burned. You argued with him. Witnesses heard you. And then he disappeared for months before coming home, only to die weeks later. What really happened? Rurik looked around at the stunned faces, then back at Tamsin. He unbuttoned his jacket slowly, as if shedding a roll he'd worn too long. I didn't kill Kale, he said, voice low but firm, but I failed him. That night in Reykjavik, he went back into the burning lab to save the research files, the ones that proved the project was being weaponized. I tried to stop him. I should have gone in after him, but I was afraid. By the time I gathered the courage, the roof collapsed. He paused, swallowing hard. He didn't die in the fire. He made it out, badly burned but alive. He went north, hid in a fishing village, sent the files to a journalist in Oslo. Then he came home. To you, he said, glancing at Alara. But someone found him. I don't know who. Maybe the same people who funded Project Theta. Maybe someone else. All I know is he didn't drown by accident, and he didn't take his own life. A sob escaped Alara. She sank into a nearby pew, hands covering her face. Tamsin felt the room spin. All these years she'd carried the guilt of leaving, of not being there when her father died. But the truth was worse. He'd been hunted, and the man standing before her, her mother's fiancé, had been part of the world that destroyed him. Then why are you here? She asked Rurik, voice cracking. Why pretend to love her? To make yourself feel better? No, he said quietly. I came back because I saw your photographs. The ones from the refugee camps, the drought zones. You document people the world forgets. Just like your father wanted to protect the ocean from being forgotten, I recognized his spirit in you. And I thought, maybe I could help you carry what he left behind. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a small, water-stained envelope. This was mailed to me last year, from Oslo. It's a copy of the article your father's files helped publish. It ran in January 1990, 3 weeks after he died. The project was shut down. Careers ended. But no one was ever charged. And your father's name was never mentioned. He held it out to Tamsin. She didn't take it. Instead, she turned to her mother. Did you know he was working on something dangerous? Alara nodded, tears falling onto her dress. He told me bits of it. Said he was trying to stop something bad. I didn't understand the details, but I saw the fear in his eyes. After he came back from Iceland, he slept with a knife under his pillow. He taught you how to swim not just for fun, but so you could escape if someone came for us. Tamsin remembered that now. The way her father would drill her on tides and currents, on how to read the sky for storms. She'd thought it was just his love of the sea, but it was survival. The wind howled louder. Rain lashed the windows. The ceremony was over, not with a kiss, but with a reckoning. Guests began to murmur, some standing, others whispering to each other. Maren, Ilara's oldest friend, moved to comfort her. Inga, Rurik's so-called cousin, slipped out the side door without a word. Tamsin looked at the two people who had shaped her life. Her mother, broken by fear, and the man who had once stood beside her father on a rocky shore, now standing in the ruins of a wedding he never should have started. "I don't hate you," she said to Rurik, surprising even herself, "but I can't forgive you yet. Not until I know everything." He nodded. "Ask me anything." "Who sent the man to our door after the funeral?" "I don't know his name," Rurik said, "but I know the agency. It was a black budget unit under National Defense, disbanded in '92, but its people scattered into private security, intelligence, even academia. One of them tracked Kale down. I've spent years trying to find out who." Tamsin thought of the dry clothes, the lack of water in her father's lungs. If he didn't drown. "How did he die?" Rurik's voice dropped to a whisper. "Poison, slow-acting, mimics heart failure. Used by certain intelligence groups during the Cold War. I found a reference to it in declassified files last year. The symptoms match." Ilara let out a small broken sound. "He was sick for days before. I thought it was stress. He wouldn't let me call a doctor." Tamsin closed her eyes. Her father had known. He'd felt it coming. And he'd chosen to die quietly to protect them. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. She looked around the chapel, the flowers, the candles, the half-written guest book. This wasn't supposed to happen here, but maybe it had to. Maybe the truth needed a witness. "I'm going to Reykjavik," she said suddenly. Both Ilara and Rurik looked at her, startled. "The original files," Tamsin explained. "The journalist who published the story, she might still be alive. And if there's anything left in the archives, I need to see it." "For him," Rurik nodded slowly. "I'll go with you." "No," Tamsin said. "Not yet. I need to do this alone. But if what you say is true, maybe one day," she turned to her mother, "are you coming home with me?" Ilara looked at the altar, at the ring still sitting on the velvet pillow, at the life she'd tried to rebuild. Then she took a deep breath and stood. "Yes," she said. "It's time." They left the chapel together, mother and daughter, walking through the rain without umbrellas, as if washing something away. Behind them, Rurik remained, standing alone in the empty room, the unopened envelope still in his hand. Outside, the storm raged. But for the first time in years, Tamsin felt clear. The mystery wasn't solved, not fully, but the silence was broken. And that, her father had written, was the first step. As they reached the car, Ilara reached for Tamsin's hand. It was cold, but she held on tight. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Tamsin squeezed back. "Me too." And in that moment, beneath the gray Nova Scotian sky, something began to heal, not because the past was fixed, but because they were finally facing it together. In the days after the wedding that never was, the house on the cliff felt different, not quieter, but clearer, as if a fog had lifted from the rooms themselves. Ilara moved through the halls with a new kind of slowness, not the careful tiptoeing of someone avoiding pain, but the steady pace of someone finally ready to face it. She packed away the blue dress, folded the unused napkins, and placed the unopened bottle of champagne back in the cellar. There was no anger in her, only a deep, quiet sorrow and something else, something like relief. Tamsin stayed. She hadn't planned to, not really. She'd meant to leave for Reykjavik within the week, chasing leads in old archives and newspaper offices. But something held her back. Maybe it was the way her mother kept glancing at her father's empty chair at the kitchen table, or how she'd started talking about him in full sentences. Again, not just "your father loved the sea," but "your father once stayed up all night fixing Mrs. Callahan's boat because her grandson was sick and she needed to get to the mainland by dawn." One rainy afternoon, While sorting through a box of old tax files in the study, Tamsin found a manila envelope tucked behind a stack of nautical charts. Inside were photocopies of declassified Canadian intelligence documents, some heavily redacted, others surprisingly intact. One memo, dated January 1990, referenced Project Theta termination and listed asset neutralization as a contingency. Another mentioned a civilian consultant Voss K with a note, status contained. Her hands shook as she read it. Contained, not dead, not retired, contained, like a problem that needed managing. She showed it to her mother that evening over stew and crusty bread. Ilara stared at the page for a long time before speaking. I always wondered why they stopped coming, she said softly. After the first year, the cars disappeared. The phone stopped ringing in the middle of the night. I thought maybe they'd forgotten us. But maybe they thought Cale's work died with him. Except it didn't, Tamsin said. The article ran. The project ended. Someone talked. Maybe that's why they left us alone, Ilara mused. Because the damage was already done. But Tamsin wasn't satisfied. She needed names, motives, proof that could stand in the light, not just whispers in the dark. She spent nights cross-referencing names from the documents with public records, tracking down retired scientists, even reaching out to a journalist in Oslo, whose byline matched the one Rurik had mentioned. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A retired librarian in Reykjavik named Hildur, who'd once worked part-time at the university archive, where Project Theta's civilian records were stored. In a shaky email written in careful English, Hildur wrote, I remember Cale. He came often, always polite, always in a hurry. After the fire, he asked for copies of everything, sonar logs, personnel lists, funding sources. I gave him what I could. Later, I heard he sent it all to a woman named Astrid Volden. She worked for Morgenbladet. She might still be alive. Tamsin booked a flight. But before she left, she met Rurik one last time. He'd been staying in a small guest house on the edge of town, keeping his distance. They met at the Harbor Cafe, the same place where fishermen gathered at dawn and tourists came for chowder at noon. He arrived early, sitting by the window with a cup of black coffee, staring out at the boats bobbing in the gray water. When Tamsin sat down, he didn't smile, just nodded. I'm going to Reykjavik, she said. I know, he replied. I read your mother's email. She told you? She's worried. But she also trusts you. That's new. They sat in silence for a moment, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation filling the space between them. Why did you really come back? Tamsin asked, not unkindly. Was it guilt? Or something else? Rurik stirred his coffee, though he didn't drink it. Both, maybe. After the fire, I tried to forget. Changed my name, left Iceland, joined a monastery in the Highlands, spent 10 years in silence working the land, praying for forgiveness I didn't deserve. But guilt doesn't fade. It just changes shape. He looked at her then, really looked. Then I saw your photo essay on the drought in Kenya. You'd taken a picture of a woman walking 10 miles for water, her child on her back, the sky cracked like dry earth. And in her eyes, I saw Cale, that same stubborn hope. I realized his daughter was still fighting the kind of battles he believed in. And I thought maybe I could help. Not to fix the past, but to protect what's left of it. Tamsin studied him. His hands were rough, calloused from years of physical labor. His eyes held a weariness that wasn't just age. It was regret worn smooth by time. You could have told us the truth sooner, she said. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid Ilara would shut me out. And maybe I wanted to believe I could start over. That love could be enough to cover old sins, but it's not. Tamsin said gently. Love doesn't erase truth. It just makes it harder to hide, he nodded. You're right. She reached into her bag and pulled out a copy of her father's journal entry from December 1st, 1989. The last one. She slid it across the table. Rurik read it slowly. When he finished, his eyes were wet. He knew, he whispered. He knew they'd come for him. And he chose to stay, Tamsin said. To protect us, not run? Rurik folded the paper carefully and handed it back. I'll wait here, he said. If you find anything, if you need help, I'm not going anywhere. Tamsin didn't promise anything, but for the first time she didn't feel the need to push him away. 2 days later, she landed in Reykjavik under a sky so pale it looked washed out. The city was smaller than she expected, clean, quiet, wrapped in a kind of dignified solitude. She took a taxi to a modest apartment building on the outskirts of town, where Astrid Volden, now 82, lived with her cat and a lifetime of newspaper clippings. Astrid opened the door in a wool cardigan, her white hair in a loose bun, her eyes sharp behind round glasses. She didn't seem surprised to see Tamsin. "I've been expecting someone," she said in lightly accented English. "Not you exactly, but someone." She led Tamsin into a cozy living room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. A kettle whistled on the stove. Over tea, Astrid told her story. In 1989, she was an investigative reporter known for digging into government secrecy. Cale had contacted her through an encrypted letter drop, a method used by whistleblowers during the Cold War. He'd sent microfilm hidden inside a postcard of puffins. "The files were damning," Astrid said, her voice steady. "They showed that Project Theta wasn't just about tracking submarines. It was about creating a sonic weapon that could disorient entire marine ecosystems, disrupt migration, cause mass strandings, even induce panic in human divers. The military called it acoustic denial. Cale called it ocean torture. She'd published the story in January 1990. The fallout was immediate. The project was shut down. Several officials resigned. But no one was prosecuted, and Cale's name was never mentioned by his request. He said if they knew he'd leaked it, they'd come for his family, Astrid explained. "So I protected him, buried his identity. But I always wondered, did they find him anyway?" Tamsin told her about the dry clothes, the lack of water in his lungs, the slow-acting poison Rurik had described. Astrid's face darkened. There was a unit, part of a joint NATO task force that specialized in quiet removals. They used toxins that mimicked natural causes. We suspected they were involved in several disappearances during the 80s. If Cale was targeted, it fits. She stood and went to a filing cabinet, pulling out a slim folder. Inside was a copy of the original microfilm scans, and a name Tamsin hadn't seen before. Dr. Elias Croft, Project Theta Liaison, Department of National Defense. Croft was the Canadian handler, Astrid said. He coordinated between the scientists and the military. After the scandal, he vanished. Changed his name. Some say he went into private security. Others say he died in a boating accident off Newfoundland. But I never believed that. Tamsin's pulse quickened. A name, a thread. Back in Black Harbor, she dug deeper. Using public records and old university alumni lists, she found that Elias Croft had once taught oceanography at Dalhousie University, just an hour's drive from her hometown. And though his official records ended in 1991, a property deed showed he'd bought a cabin on a remote island in the Bay of Fundy in 1993, under the name E.C. Marlowe. She showed the address to her mother. Ilara went very still. "I've seen that name," she whispered. "On a boat registration. Years ago. Docked near the old lighthouse. I thought it was a coincidence. It wasn't. Tamsin didn't go to the island. Not yet. She wasn't a vigilante. She was a witness. And witnesses needed proof, not revenge. Instead, she compiled everything. The journal entries, the declassified memos, Astrid's files, Rurik's testimony, and sent a carefully worded letter to a trusted investigative journalist in Toronto, along with a request for anonymity. She didn't ask for a story, just for someone to look, then she waited. In the meantime, something unexpected happened. Ilara began to talk, really talk. Not just about Cale's death, but his life, how he'd taught her to read tide charts, how he'd danced with her in the kitchen to old jazz records, how he'd held Tamsin as a baby and whispered, "You're going to change the world," one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the waves gold. Ilara said, "I thought if I kept quiet I was protecting you. But all I did was leave you alone with your questions." Tamsin reached for her hand. "I'm not alone anymore." And for the first time in years it felt true. Rurik came by the next day, not to the house, but to the beach where Tamsin was walking. He didn't say much, just handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a key. "This opens a safety deposit box in Reykjavik," he said. "I rented it the year after Cale died. I put everything I could find in there. His missing notes, lab schematics, even a recording he made the night before the fire. I was too afraid to give it to anyone, but you? You're ready." Tamsin looked at the key, cool and heavy in her palm. "Why now?" she asked. "Because truth isn't just about exposing lies," he said. "It's about honoring the people who paid the price for it." She didn't thank him. She just nodded, and in that moment, standing on the shore where her father had once taught her to skip stones, Tamsin understood something. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about carrying it with care, like a fragile shell, beautiful and broken, worth keeping. The key Rurik gave her sat on Tamsin's nightstand for 3 days before she decided what to do with it. She turned it over in her fingers each evening, the metal cool and smooth, worn from years of being carried in a pocket or hidden in a drawer. It wasn't just a key, it was a choice, to open the past one last time or to let it rest. She chose to open it. She flew back to Reykjavik in early spring, when the days were longer and the wind carried the first hints of thaw. The bank was a modest stone building near the old harbor, its lobby quiet and smelling faintly of cedar and ink. She handed over the key and her passport, and a clerk led her to a small room with a single table and a steel box on top. Inside were 2 things, a stack of yellowed papers bound with twine, and a cassette tape labeled in her father's handwriting, "For Tamsin, if I don't make it home." Her hands trembled as she held the tape. She hadn't seen a cassette player in years, but the bank clerk, noticing her hesitation, produced an old one from a back office. "My grandfather's," he said with a small smile. "Still works." She pressed play. At first there was only static. Then a voice, familiar, warm, achingly present. "Tamsin," her father said, as if speaking directly to her across time. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry. Not for leaving, but for not telling you the truth sooner. I thought I was protecting you. But silence is its own kind of danger." He spoke for nearly 20 minutes about Project Theta, about the fire, about the men who came to his door in Iceland asking for the files. He said he'd sent copies to Astrid, hidden others in a locker at the Reykjavik bus station, which Tamsin later found empty. Someone had beaten her to it, and kept one final set in the safety deposit box. "I didn't want you to grow up afraid," he said. "But I also didn't want you to think the world was kinder than it is. Be brave, little Tide. The truth is worth the cost." When the tape ended, Tamsin sat in silence for a long time, tears drying on her cheeks. She wasn't angry anymore, just sad and proud. She took the documents back to Black Harbor, not to expose them, but to understand them. With Ilara beside her at the kitchen table, they read through her father's notes, diagrams of sonar arrays, logs of abnormal whale behavior near test sites, a list of names, including Elias Crofts. One page stood out, a hand-drawn map of the Bay of Fundy, with a small island circled and the words Marlowe's Place scribbled in the margin. They didn't go there. Tamsin had already sent everything to the journalist in Toronto. A few weeks later, a carefully researched article appeared in a national magazine. No names accused, no conspiracy theories, just facts. A Cold War-era ocean project, ethical breaches, a scientist who tried to speak up, and a system that buried the truth to protect its own. It didn't go viral. It didn't lead to arrests. But it was read and remembered. That was enough. Ilara, for her part, began to heal in quiet ways. She started volunteering at the Marine Education Center, teaching children about tides and plankton and the importance of listening to the ocean. She even agreed to be interviewed for a local history project about Black Harbor's fishing families. When the interviewer asked about her late husband, she didn't say, "heart attack." She said, "He died standing up for what was right." Tamsin stayed through the summer. She walked the beaches with her camera, not chasing big stories, but capturing small truths. The way light hit the water at dawn, the hands of an old fisherman mending his nets, her mother laughing as she tried to bake her father's favorite blueberry pie and burned it twice. One morning, she found Ilara on the back porch holding a small wooden box filled with ashes. "I kept them all these years," Ilara said softly. "I couldn't let go. But I think he'd want us to." They drove to the lighthouse, the same one where the wedding was supposed to happen, and walked down to the rocky shore. The sea was calm, the sky clear. Tamsin held her father's journal in one hand, the cassette tape in the other. Together, they scattered his ashes into the tide. As the wind carried the last of him out to sea, Tamsin whispered, "We found the truth, Dad, and we're okay." Ilara leaned into her, silent tears mixing with sea spray. Rurik didn't come that day. He'd left Black Harbor a week earlier, after a quiet conversation with Tamsin on the porch. "I've stayed too long," he'd said. "My presence is a reminder of pain, not peace." She hadn't argued. But before he left, she gave him a photograph she'd taken the week before, of Ilara and her, standing on the dock at sunset, arms around each other, finally looking like mother and daughter again. He'd nodded, tucked it into his coat, and walked away without looking back. Months later, Tamsin began a new photo series. She called it Echoes. It wasn't about war zones or disasters. It was about ordinary people living with inherited silence. The daughter of a disappeared teacher in Argentina, a fisherman in the Philippines whose father vanished during a coup, a woman in Nova Scotia who finally spoke her father's name after 30 years. Each portrait was paired with a short handwritten note from the subject. No grand revelations, just truth offered gently. The series was exhibited in a small gallery in Halifax. Ilara came to the opening, wearing a dress the color of sea glass and a smile that reached her eyes. She stood for a long time in front of the final photograph, a black and white image of the lighthouse at dawn, empty, peaceful, with the words beneath it, "Some truths don't need witnesses. They just need to be spoken." After the show, Tamsin received a letter from Reykjavik. No return address, just a postmark and a single sheet of paper. It was from Astrid. "Your father would be proud," it read. "You didn't seek revenge. You sought understanding. That is the rarest kind of courage." Tamsin pinned the letter to her studio wall, beside her father's journal and the key that had unlocked everything. Life didn't go back to normal, because normal had been built on silence. But something better took its place. A life shaped by honesty, by presence, by the quiet strength of two women who chose to face the past together, instead of running from it. One evening, as autumn painted the trees in golden rust, Tamsin sat on the porch with her mother, sipping tea and watching the gulls wheel over the water. "Do you think he's at peace now?" Ilara asked. Tamsin thought of the journal, the tape, the ashes carried out to sea. "I think he always was," she said. "He just wanted us to be." And in the soft hush of the falling night, with the ocean breathing steadily against the shore, it felt like enough.